din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. новостях в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 20th of December, 2025. And here we are with a live stream on, well, it's the second episode in our series, The Fall of the West, as it will be titled going forward. And what we're doing in this series is outlining how the use of the Marxist theories of crisis can help us understand the condition of the West in this moment. So, first episode last time was an overview and introduction. This one we're going to get into the meat of things. So this one's going to be focused mainly on the declining rate of profit. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But we will have future episodes coming up on, this declining rate of profit episode, by the way, will probably need to be 2 episodes long, because there's the theoretical side and then there's the practical side. There's the empirical side, where the theory can, thanks to the work of various Marxist economists in the modern era, such as Paul Cockshott, Andrew Kleiman, Michael Roberts, and others, has been borne out by analysis of the data on investments that's available from the United States and also from Britain. So first episode will be outlining the terms and going through the theory, and then we'll look at the practical side in the second episode of this next week. But the other point is that we're going to be looking also going forward at monopolization and the advanced degree of monopolization in the United States, Britain, and Europe. And then from there, we're going to look at the system that grew from the 1990s through to the 2010s, the sort of global division, or the attempt to create like a global division of labor by the US and the other imperialist powers, and why that has ultimately failed. And then we're going to also then go on to look at the other side of things, which is not just the economic side, but how the economic side leads to and is the starting point of, but also is reinforced by the cultural side of things. So going to be looking at like postmodernism and all of its foul spawn and its thinkers as well in the near future. But tonight we will get into the declining rate of profit. So be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're currently live on YouTube, on X, on Substack, on Twitch, and on Rumble. So be sure to subscribe to all those platforms, because you never know when YouTube's going to pull the plug on us. So to begin with then, when we say when we're talking about the falling rate of profit, let's talk about what this actually means. And here is the premise of this particular program. And it taps into the wider overall premise of this series, which is that the crisis of the West isn't just something that's existed since 2008, or in some people's analysis, it's existed since COVID, or existed since the beginning of the Russian special military operation. What we see now with the crisis of the United States, Britain, the major European countries, and of course the wider European Union, is a reflection of a profound crisis that is the crisis of imperialism. That's the heart of it. And that crisis of imperialism has been ongoing since at least the 1890s, but with various different points at which it has manifested as violent conflagrations. And at each violent conflagration has fundamentally changed the way in which the imperialist political and intellectual leadership has been able to respond to crises. Now, what this has meant is that as time has gone on, the imperialists have had fewer and fewer tools available to them to actually resolve their crises. So Lenin analyzed in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and other works as well, mainly when we're dealing with the decline of imperialism as a system, we're looking at his work in the book Imperialism. So his analysis, drawing on J.A. Hobson and Rudolf Hilferding, was that, of course, imperialism in its modern form, not just simply the occupation and the exploitation of other countries, that had been done in an earlier form by the British, the French, and others, and the Spanish and the Portuguese, going back all the way into the 15th century, and particularly with the discovery of the Americas, the foundation of the first state-backed transnational corporations in Spain, Portugal, Britain, was at the time England, and their huge role in the early development of capitalism and how that was fueled by colonialism. We will, incidentally, be responding to the recent article in Jacobin, which claimed that colonialism wasn't as important as previously stated in the development of capitalism. We'll be getting to that in the next week or so, but ideally before Christmas. So what we're arguing here is that imperialism, of course, represented by the development of capitalism in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, Italy, the major powers, represents a fundamentally new stage, a crisis-riddled stage, because the system develops to a point where the amount of profit that could be made employing labor domestically was too low. And so they had to go out to other areas of the world, other less developed areas of the world, colonize them, and rip off the natural resources there, gain a much higher rate of exploitation of the labor in those countries than they could get away with in the domestic countries, in the imperial metropoles, shall we say. And they hope to revive the system that way. But all that leads to is a greater crisis, which manifests itself in World War I. World War I, of course, leads to an even greater crisis for imperialism, because it leads to the first lasting proletarian revolution in the world, which fundamentally changes everything in terms of how the capitalist classes of the world are able to respond to things. And this then is compounded by the Great Depression, which, partially thanks to the Bolshevik Revolution, means that the advice once given by the US Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, to liquidate everything in response to a recession, this advice is no longer able to be followed. And it's no longer able to be followed because the capitalist class and their intellectual and political leadership can no longer just simply engage in what Joseph Schumpeter referred to as creative destruction. Now, creative destruction is exactly what Mellon was calling for in 1929. And this was noted by Herbert Hoover, when Andrew Mellon was as well as being one of the biggest millionaires in the United States in 1929, was the Treasury Secretary. And he said, when faced with the Great Depression of 1929, the following. He says, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up from less competent people. So now that, of course, would be, from the point of view of capital, and him being one of the biggest capitalists in the United States at the time, the ideal way to respond to anything. But what becomes obvious to the ruling class at the time, or at least the dominant faction within the US ruling class, is that they can't get away with that. Had they tried to do what Andrew Mellon suggested that they do, then what would have happened was a huge upsurge in class struggle inside the United States that would have quickly reached violent and uncontainable proportions. You already had, even in the face of huge repression in the United States, a communist party that was rapidly growing, that was organizing across racial lines in the American South, that you had revolts all across the poorer working class areas and the rural areas of the United States in the 1930s, which is what causes the state under the command of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, to take on this much bigger role to try and stabilize things. And Roosevelt's New Deal just about manages to stabilize things in the 1930s, with the added benefit that they managed to subordinate largely the leadership of the CPUSA in the process. But it was only really the vast industrial expansion and war production of World War II which helps to create the recovery in US production. But the point about it is that the 1920s left a lingering institutional memory in the United States, which each generation of American state managers has kept in mind, which is that they can't just follow Andrew Mellon's advice. They can't just let everything go. So they've been careful since then to target their attacks on individual sections of the working class at any given time, because if they just let the whole thing go, then yes, Mellon's logic would have been ultimately correct had they managed to survive the class war that would have followed, which is that the there would have been a huge scale destruction of capital as you just let everything go bankrupt. So you let the banks go bankrupt, you let farmers go bankrupt, you let small business, big business, no matter how big it is, go bang, and then eventually the system will correct itself. And that is correct from the capitalist's point of view. But of course, that is an undialectical point of view, because there's no such thing as a pure realm of policy that's free from class struggle. And so ever since the 1930s and the Great Recession, the capitalist class in the West has been very careful not to go to the point where they essentially try to destroy the living standards of the working class all at once, and have been very careful to attack only one section of the working class at a time. Now, how is this relevant to the falling rate of profit? Well, it's relevant because the falling rate of profit is one of the key indicators that we can use to understand the crisis that has run from 2008 to the present day. And that crisis remains unresolved. And that crisis starts with the fact that the rate of profit that can be realized on investments in the West has simply been too low for too long a time. And that is a crucial thing to understand when we get to look at, like, well, why did the crisis of 2008 erupt, and why is it hollowing out the West to such a degree? Part of the reason why it is hollowing out the West is because of and I've been talking about this for quite a number of years. It's the Japanification of the Western world. Now, with the crisis that Japan has been in continually since the early 1990s, you've seen an ever-increasing role for the state. You've seen an ever-increasing amount of debt racked up. You've seen central banks try all kinds of strange policy prescriptions and spending large amounts of money to try and make sure that the crisis becomes at least stabilized. Because, and this goes back to the point where you can't just engage in creative destruction anymore, there's been a huge fear in the West of what would happen if they allowed that to go ahead. So they've opted to go down the Japan route, all of them, which is racking up more and more debt, pumping more and more liquidity via the central banks into the system, the state accumulating and guaranteeing the debt in the desperate hope that something revives profitability for the private sector further on down the road. And so far that has not happened to the degree which would see the losses incurred in 2008 to 2010 to 11 fully restored and growth be restored to consistently high enough rates that would see economic progress be made. What we've seen instead since 2008 is a series of bubbles, and culminating in the biggest bubble of them all, which is the AI bubble, where capitalists make bets on the ability of a new technology sometimes to provide a vast breakthrough in the productivity of labor, and AI is the latest bet. Before that, there were various other bets, the most prominent of them being the bet on the growth rates that could be generated by the internet itself and by businesses moving on to the internet, the dot-com bubble, which burst in 2000 to 2001. And now and we'll come here to the question of, like, the rate of profit itself. So what we've got is a situation where since the 1930s, the capitalists in the West, the imperialist ruling class, have been, generally speaking, afraid to just let things go to the wall. It would create too much chaos. It would create, or with the incredibly complicated systems that they now rely on to generate profit globally and bring it back into the imperial core, it would potentially unravel the whole global system all at once. And that is something that they cannot afford to happen. So how is this connected then to the falling rate of profit? So first of all, let's ask ourselves, what is the falling rate of profit? Now, the rate of profit is defined by Marx as profit as a percentage of capital invested. So if a company is said to make 10% profit, that is 10% profit on the capital that's invested each year. And so can be seen as the growth of capital year on year. And this is very much linked to and dependent upon the Marxist understanding of the labor theory of value. Now, just to reiterate, the labor theory of value, not something which Marx invented, but something which he took from Adam Smith and developed further. And the labor theory of value states that all added value in industry is proportional to the amount of labor employed. All profit fundamentally has its roots in human activity, human labor. So capital, Marx says, therefore consists of two elements. Constant capital, which refers to machinery, means of production, or dead labor if you prefer, and variable capital, which is human labor or living labor. Now, Marx talks about the rate of profit in Capital Volume 3. And I'm going to read a couple of quotes from that. I've got the rather charming early 1970s edition there. So Marx in Capital Volume 3 puts this as follows. The composition of capital is to be understood in a twofold sense. On the side of value, it is determined by the proportion in which it is divided into constant capital or value of the means of production, and variable capital or value of labor power, the sum total of wages. On the side of material, as it functions in the process of production, all capital is divided into means of production and living labor power. The latter composition is determined by the relation between the mass of the means of production employed on the one hand and the mass of labor necessary for their employment on the other. They call the former the value composition, the latter the technical composition of capital. So one of the arguments used by advocates for capitalism, and there are no shortage of them, unfortunately, but one of their arguments is that, well, capitalism keeps innovating. It's the most innovative system that's ever been, innovative economic system that's ever existed, and it will continue to innovate its way out of crisis. Well, what I'm going to argue is that whilst the capitalist system continues to innovate, first of all, not all of those innovations are particularly good. Second of all, the idea that they're going to innovate their way back to growth is a fallacy that they've been chasing for 25 years. And they've been unable to realize that fully. And also that they cannot escape, no matter how much the advocates for capitalism and also the doomers out there, they cannot escape the need for human labor. It's been proved, and again, we'll get to the data on this in the next episode. It's been proved over and over again that without the element of human labor, there is no profitability. See, what you see in where the capitalists innovate is that over and over again, first of all, that innovation is constrained. And it's been estimated, and I'll give you, this is an example of the fact that their innovation is constrained by the fact that they constantly need to try and avoid or stave off social unrest on the one hand, and the class war breaking out in a violent fashion, but also because technology for capitalism creates more contradictions. And this has been true for each wave of innovation. On the one hand, capital looks to replace skilled workers with non-skilled workers. It then looks to replace the unskilled workers with even lower skilled workers and to employ fewer of them as well. That has been a constant pressure. The most rapid breakthroughs in productivity, i.e. the pioneering of new technology and the employment of that new technology, have often happened when capital is under extreme pressure to undermine the bargaining position of labor, meaning that where there's a series of strikes, where there's workers who have a good degree of bargaining power who are taking action, capital will then seek to innovate away their jobs. Happened in Britain in the 19th century all the time. It's been happening ever since. But what that does is, first of all, it provides a new burst of energy into capitalist production. That's true. And it produces a short-term uptick in the profits made by industry. But what it leads to ultimately is, again, you end up back in a cyclical crisis again. And one of the reasons why you end up back in a cyclical crisis is because after that initial boost of profit from the employment of new, highly productive technology, which is labor-saving technology, it ends up falling back again and falling back to into crisis again. And part of the reason is because when you increase what Marx referred to as constant capital in the composition of capital, so that means that when the amount of means of production increases and the amount of variable capital, that is human labor, goes down, what it actually does is it undermines the rate of the ultimate rate of return that you get on your invested capital, because you're actually employing less human labor. And this is part of the reason why the capitalists have had the ability to automate a lot more than they ever have done since at least the 1930s, possibly earlier. And this was observed by Rajani Palm Dutt in his work on fascism, which is that the capitalists do have the ability to automate a lot more, but they often choose not to. They often choose to offshore production to get things done, actually, in some places with a lower level of technology, as we've covered before, because in actual fact, the rate of profit that you can realize on a factory that employs a lot of workers using a lower level of technology, so oftentimes the rate of profit is higher on that than a fully automated or largely automated factory in an imperial core nation. This ultimately is one of the reasons why the moves to re-industrialize the West ultimately won't work. The rate of profit on industrial investments is just too low in the West for capital to actually do it. For capital to actually do it, they would need to be backstopped or fully subsidized by the state, because the capitalists don't want to take risks. And it would be a risk to invest heavily in these massively automated plants. This is the reason why one of the things that the US capitalist class has been demanding internally through both parties of the oligarchy, so both through the Democrats and through the Republicans, but often this is expressed in a more crude form through the Republican Party, because they're more attached to the bit of the American capitalist class which is more concerned with domestic production. The Democrats are more, though again this is the lines between the two are very blurry, but they're now more the party of Wall Street, though again it must be emphasized that Wall Street invests in both parties and gets what it wants largely anyway. But the Republicans, there's the party more of domestic production, the capitalists invading domestic production, express their rather crude demands more often, which is for no unions or very little, severe limitations on the bargaining power of unions, continual lowering of wages, continual attacks on pension rights, continual expansion of the amount of exploitable labor. And that's the agenda that the Republican Party's run on basically since Reagan, and still runs on under Trump. Why? Because if you think about the measures that they're taking there, all of that is about basically restoring the profitability of US capital invested domestically by making labor more exploitable. Now, this ultimately is a reflection of the need of the capitalists to address the declining rate of profit, because they need to be able to reindustrialize effectively inside the United States. The American capitalist class needs to be able to employ American workers at a rate of exploitation that can turn a profit, and not just turn a profit, but turn a good profit. And at the moment, they can't. They have a limited ability to do that. So hence why they keep making more and more demands about how minimum wage is terrible, how they need less environmental regulations, or they need to expand the amount of labor that's exploitable, the usual thing, which is partly why the US government keeps getting itself in a knot over the question of immigration, because the demands of the capitalists, are the biggest capitalists, who either employ a lot of workers or say that they would employ more if they could, their demands are constantly for the ability to exploit labor at a greater rate. a higher rate of exploitation. And for a variety of historical reasons, that they still can't quite get the level of exploitation that they require in order to make more profit. Hence why the demands for constantly expanding labor pool. Now, to go back to the declining rate of profit, Marx had this to say in Capital Volume 3 about the actual awareness of the capitalists of what they're doing. So this is from Volume 3 of Capital, Chapter 2, entitled The Rate of Profit. The page in my edition is page 41, if you want to follow along. So this is the beginning of the chapter. Quote reads as follows: "The capitalist advances the total capital without regard to the different roles played by its components in the production of surplus value. He advances all these components uniformly, not just to reproduce the advanced capital, but rather to produce value in excess of it. The only way in which he can convert the value of his advanced variable capital," so that's the human labor side of things, "into a greater value is by exchanging it for living labor and exploiting living labor. But he cannot exploit this labor unless he makes a simultaneous advance of the conditions for performing this labor, namely means of labor and subjects of labor, machinery and raw materials. Unless he converts a certain amount of value in his possession into the form of conditions of production, for he is a capitalist and can undertake the process of exploiting labor only because, being the owner of the conditions of labor, he confronts the laborer as the owner of only labor power. As already shown in the first book," that's the first edition of Capital, "it is precisely the fact that non-workers own the means of production which turns laborers into wage workers and non-workers into capitalists. The capitalist does not care whether it considered that he advances constant capital to make a profit out of his variable capital, or he advances variable capital to enhance the value of the constant capital, that he invests money in wages to raise the value of his machinery and raw materials, or that he invests money in machinery and raw materials to be able to exploit labor. Although it is only the variable portion of capital which creates surplus value, it does so only if the other portions, the conditions of production, are likewise advanced." So what all that means is basically, of course, the average capitalist might not understand any of these things. He might not understand the difference between constant and variable capital. He might not understand the way in which profit is realized. He's just told by his experts that, well, if you invest in this machine, sir, you will, of course, make more money. And he dutifully follows the advice of his advisors. But Marx's point there, and again, this is like an example of like the dialectic in the economic form in action, which is that in order to make money, in order to actually outcompete his rivals, the capitalist has to invest in a certain amount of new means of production, find new sources of natural resources to exploit, find new ways in which to get more out of the labor force that he has available to him. And therefore, like, he has to invest in both his variable capital and his constant capital. And this, though, comes back on him in the form of a problem, which is that, on the one hand, invests in his constant capital, meaning the machinery, the means of production, and gains a certain advantage for a certain amount of time, but then also needs to invest in his variable capital in order to make money. And this is why, even when you have highly automated production lines in the imperialist countries, you still have the struggle over the working day. You still have even with fewer workers, the capitalist is constantly looking to get more out of them, because, as Marx identifies in this chapter and has been developed by other Marxists afterwards, the fact that you have this tendency of the rate of profit to fall in line with or related to the adoption of new technology means that the capitalist is constantly engaged in a process of trial and error, a constant process of trying to push forward with technological innovation, but also he's held back by the fact that this will ultimately damage the rate of return he gets on his capital. So you see that capitalism is stuck in this constant push-pull. They want to innovate on the one hand, they want to do away with as much labor as possible, but on the other hand, without human labor, profitability declines. So what this is part of, and this is related to, the inbuilt tendency within capitalism towards parasitism, because you've got this problem in industry that imperialism is unable to address. Now, I don't want to give the impression that it's just an uninterrupted downward spiral ever since like the 1880s. Decline is relative. Like the British, the French, the Germans, the Americans were all so far ahead of the rest of the world that, again, decline, of course, is relative. It's not just an uninterrupted downward trend. And this is why we call it a tendency, the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It's like over time, the rate of profit will fall. But there's countervailing tendencies within that. The first countervailing tendency is, of course, the attempt to exploit or hyper-exploit the domestic working class more. And here we will get to the point about the crisis since the 1960s as a demonstration of this fact, of this law in action. Crisis of the 1960s arrives after more or less 20 years of consistent overall growth in the West, post World War II. You get to the point where you have seen in the United States strong growth rates from 1945, well, actually going back into World War II, but from the end of the war through the 1960s, yes, there's been ups and downs, small recessions, but the general trend has been upward growth. But what's also been going on at the same time is that, again, rate of profit has been falling, reaches a crisis point in the 1960s, and the response of the US capitalist class in the 1960s is twofold. First of all, they engage in more imperialist aggression overseas. So the reason why, of course, the Vietnam War does not end in 1965-66 is partially related to the fact that US capitalism was starting to get into trouble. And the strategists of the US ruling class realized that they needed to have more areas of the world available for exploitation, not less. It's not just about exploiting Vietnam, even though they would have loved to have done that. It was about the old imperial domino theory, which is attacked by leftists as being, oh, it's untrue. But domino theory has some validity to it, which is that a successful revolution in one part of the world is going to lead to shall we say, inspirations. They're going to provide inspiration for revolutions in other parts of the world, and particularly in similar parts of the world. And this is, again, part of the motivation for the US to engage in the genocide of communists in Indonesia. They could imperialism absolutely could not afford to lose Indonesia, and was prepared to invest a lot of money in Suharto to get to the point where they could make a capitalist success story out of Indonesia, and that was what necessitated the genocide. Now, so they increase their aggression overseas. Ultimately, in Indonesia they won, in Vietnam they lost. But at the same time, domestically, what are they doing? Domestically, what they're doing is trying to increase the rate of exploitation of the US working class. And if you look at like the later 1960s and into the early 1970s inside the United States, you see an uptick in class struggle across the United States. And there were various different Marxist organizations that tried to get in on this action. It was the early days of the old Revolutionary Communist Party before it became a Bobovakian cult. were heavily involved in trying to work within the established trade unions to agitate for more militant struggle, because the class struggle intensified throughout the late 1960s into the early 1970s. This periodically intersected with like the anti-war movement, but the class struggle in the United States very much intensifies after the middle of the 1960s, and this then goes further into the 1980s with like Reagan's attacks on trade unions in the United States, etc. This is all an attempt to counteract the falling rate of profit by doing the traditional thing, which is attack the working class's level of organization, try to increase the rate of exploitation of the working class inside the United States. And this is partially successful, but not successful enough. So they managed to destroy the bargaining power of certain unions inside the United States. They managed to essentially de-unionize some areas. And this isn't enough, though, to lead to the full-scale revival of the rates of growth that had existed prior to 1965. It's also running alongside the fact the US had to, of course, give up the gold standard, adopt the fiat currency approach, that kind of thing. But the attempt to find a restoration of profitability by increasing the exploitation of the domestic working class, that really ends, well, it doesn't end, but like they move into a new phase from the end of the 80s. See, from the end of the 80s, of course, with the counter-revolutions in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the US ruling class finds itself with a unique opportunity to restore greater degrees of profitability. It's my argument that the US and the West was actually in a profound crisis in the 1980s themselves, which they masked by debt expansion, basically, by increasing speculation, by increasing financialization. But that's a connected but separate thing. So US finds itself in 1992 with, again, a very unique opportunity, the one that few imperialist powers ever have, which is that the alternative system has almost completely collapsed by 1992. China is on the capitalist road by 1992, still under CPC rule, but very much on the capitalist road, as is Vietnam. So Cuba is besieged, the DPRK is besieged. So of the socialist countries that remain, they're either taking a pro-capitalist road, you can argue about the reasons why, or they are small enough to not be too worried about being like sources of revolution. You can now, as the US, define an entire era by your actions now. And this is the challenge facing the Clinton administration and its acolytes in the 1990s. So what do? Well, what you can do then is as we've talked about before, to try and get over the crisis of profitability of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you can now engage in a vast offshoring of production to remove production from the imperial core nations and send it to literally almost anywhere in the world. A lot of it goes to China from the United States, a lot of it goes to Mexico, some of it goes to Indonesia, some of it goes to Thailand, much later on, Cambodia, India being another place for it. So the restoring profitability by the US capitalist class and the British and the Germans, French to a slightly lesser degree, but with Britain and the United States in particular, their option is now, well, we've tried restoring profitability by increasing the rate of exploitation of labor domestically, and that hasn't done the trick. So we need to find sources of labor which are more hyper exploitable. Hence why the US and the British create this global system of neo-colonialism. And this is what emerges from the 1990s. So you have institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and others, but these are the big three, which define what comes to be called globalization. Now, globalization, in actual fact, is the attempt to extend a global neo-colonial system into every country in the world, and to create a global division of labor, and to have the rules of the game set by the US and Britain, with the French and the Germans playing a role as well. But principally, it's the Anglos doing it. And their aim, their vision is they're going to have this global division of labor where the dirty business of commodity production will mostly be done, especially like for cheaper commodity production, will mostly be done China, later on in India, Indonesia, places like that, where you can have a ready availability of hyper exploitable labor. You can also see that this is where you got the vast boost in the garment production industry in places like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India as well, Pakistan as well. And the aim of this is to, again, address that profitability issue. So you create this global system whereby you, as the West, decide because you can control the flows of capital, you can decide what gets invested in where. So you can decide that, well, Bangladesh is very good for garment production, no safety standards, a huge amount of hyper exploitable labor with very little workers' organizations. We can really make some money there. Same consideration is made with Sri Lanka, same with Thailand, same with Cambodia, same with Vietnam. And we can now exploit that. And we can decide what each nation will produce. Now, some nations are better at resisting this than others, or turning it to their own advantage. The Chinese, we've covered before, have a certain model, which they did manage to turn some of that to their advantage via getting hold of some of the technological secrets of the West, again, all through legitimate contracts quite a lot of the time. So the whining of the West about this is just self-pitying nonsense. The other thing, the others who managed to turn it to their own advantage, Vietnam did as well. And these were, of course, two countries that kept hold of a certain amount of economic planning, despite the fact that they're on the road to running a market economy. But it's a market economy which has a strong state planning system incorporated into it, and therefore it's not just the case that the US and the British and the Germans, etc., are just ripping them off. They are careful. They are more careful in their playing of this game. But the point is that this global division of labor that they attempted to create was designed to keep the commodities flowing into the imperial core nations, capital flowing outward and then back into the imperial core nations, capital deciding where's a good investment spot for different elements of labor, continual deindustrialization of the imperial core nations. And again, this is a process which, in British terms, takes off really, starts to manifest itself prior to World War I, but it really speeds up after the middle 1960s. It was a slower process up until then. It was mergers, consolidations, monopolizations. But after the middle 1960s, the deindustrialization really took off. And in the US case, it was happening in the 60s and 70s, but again, really takes off in the 80s, and then it gets put on steroids after NAFTA in the 1990s. And incidentally, that's when, of course, the Democrats lose almost all of their representation in the American South to the Republicans after NAFTA, pioneered by the Clinton administration, who Bernie Sanders told you all to vote for, as did Noam Chomsky. See our Decline of All episode yesterday about that guy. This really takes off in the 90s, and it damages the Democratic Party to an irreversible extent in the American South after NAFTA is correctly seen to be responsible for the vast waves of deindustrialization that were the true legacy, or part of the true legacy, of the Clinton administration in the 1990s. And the aim of all this, ultimately, is to get around deindustrialization by taking industry elsewhere and making sure the profits flowed back into the pockets of the US ruling class. So this is the attempt by the US and the British to get over the decline rate of profit in the 1990s, to create a global neo-colonial system, to control the economies of the developing world via your ability to control capital flows, control trade flows, control what gets invested in and what doesn't get invested in. That's their attempt to get over this. And it doesn't work. For all of the profits that were made in the 1990s and 2000s, given the huge opportunity that US imperialism and British imperialism had at their disposal in 1992, what actually happens, though, is quite disappointing. And if you were thinking this was going to lead to some kind of long-term stability, because if you read the utopian predictions regarding what they referred to it as globalization in the 1990s, it was going to be perpetual peace. We're going to be in Immanuel Kant's world of perpetual peace via this construction of this huge mutually dependent world, which will be controlled via the rules-based order, the rules decided upon by Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin, of course. So why didn't it work? Because really the US gets 10 years of growth, then you hit the dot-com bubble, and then you get a recession, then you get a brief recession after 9/11, then the Bush administration attempts to juice the economy again by further tax cuts, leads to an escalating bubble, and ultimately the whole thing goes kaput in 2008. So that's 16 years. That's not a long time when you consider like the long upward swing of capitalist production. What you end up with is the laws of capital reassert themselves and bring the U.S. economy down like a house of cards in 2008. And it only narrowly avoided the whole situation being a hell of a lot worse. And the Chinese bailout for the U.S. had a lot to do with that. So what's happening there? What's happening is the part of it, and it not by no means all of it, but part of it is down to the declining rate of profit reasserting itself, and the inability of the US and the British to get past that, despite all of the stuff that they've done since the early 90s, all of the outsourcing and offshoring, all of the innovations and fully automated production lines. They still can't get past the tendency of the system towards crisis, which is called which at its heart it has the tendency of the rate of profit to fall in the middle of it. Now, what I'm going to do now is take some questions from the audience, and then I'm going to get back to talking about the numbers on this next week. So this is our sort of look at the law that the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. We'll be talking about the numbers and the meaning of those next time. So I'll get now to comments from the floor. So hello to Kyrek J.L. Anderson, 13, Gonzalo. Hello to you. Nikki, hello to you. Wicked Witch of the Southeast, hello to you. Will Johnson, SRGC6VH says, Chris Cutrone, the self-described last Marxist, dismissed the idea of the falling rate of profit. Well, that's one of many things that Chris Cutrone is entirely wrong about. And when we do the numbers episode, I hope to demonstrate that more comprehensively. Hello to Robert in the belly of the beast. Hello to Chris Rogers in Southeast Wales. Hello to Jerry, Richard Madden, Jonathan C. 1390, Almir in the once and future Socialist Republic of Slovenia in the Greater Yugoslavia. Hello to Abtin and to Comrade Jawad, James Graham, Sweet Coco New says, I heard in Russia recently that some were prosecuted for communist teachings as it was interpreted as danger to the state's security. I've not checked the validity of this story. Do you know more about it? It is true. It's a group of Marxists in Russia who were being prosecuted for a conspiracy to overthrow the state, essentially using the same reasoning that the German state did in their recent judgment on Marxism as subversive ideology, because the argument used by the Germans was that Marxism inevitably leads to subversion against the state. And they're kind of right, it does. That's the only conclusion one can actually come to, is that the current state of things needs to fundamentally change. And in the Russian case, it's a similar thing. They're interpreting things that way. The Russian state piled on like some idiotic charges about like, oh, well, they were planning to launch a conspiracy to overthrow the state, and their weapons were going to be trenching tools. So what? You're going to take on the FSB and the Rosguardia using what, trench shovels? What, 5 guys with trench shovels are going to overthrow the Russian state? Somebody should tell the British ruling class, because apparently they missed out on this amazing weapon that was so powerful. So it's anti-communist bullshit from the Russian state, but it shouldn't be a surprise, because again, like, the Russian state is constantly engaged in this balancing act under Putin now, where on the one hand they have to try and claim the legacy of the Soviet Union as and that they are the continuers of the Soviet legacy in order to legitimize themselves, because there's no legitimacy to be found by claiming continuity with the Tsardom. Just doesn't work. But on the other hand, the root of the Putin system is the anti-communist counter-revolutions of 1989, 1991, and 1993 in Russia. So how do you are running a system, if you're Putin, which includes some very aggressive reactionary anti-communist forces. So how do you square that circle? Well, it's difficult, to say the least. And at the same time, the capitalist class in Russia and their reactionary servants keep screaming and demanding more anti-communist measures. So a high-profile trial of a bunch of communists for anti-state subversion serves a political purpose for the Putin system, proves that he's going after the subversives. And this is why also if you read like the commentaries of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, you can see that that this is happening all the time. Like, KPRF deputies in regions get arrested, KPRF activists get arrested. The left front leader, Sergei Odaltsov, is still in prison on terrorism charges. That's been well over 18 months now. So let's be, absolutely clear about what we're dealing with here. Like, the Putin system is a complicated and strange thing, given that it has to try and claim the Soviet legacy, but has to try and repurpose it as part of this great Russian civilizational story. They are at the point now where they're more prepared to like lean into the legacy and try and claim the legacy of Stalin whilst denouncing the legacy of Lenin. They're like reverse Trotskyites that way. And this is the mess that's produced. You also have a problem in Russia, which is that there are still a significant, but it's a minority, but there are Russian domestic neo-Nazis. One of them, a teenage, rather foolish and alienated and disturbed teenage boy, carried out a race attack recently using the slogan "No Lives Matter," which is a neo-Nazi slogan taken from neo-Nazi groups in the United States. See, the Russian bourgeoisie, because it's a dirty, rotten, reactionary, backward class, promote neo-Nazism in Russia. Now, a lot of these guys packed up their shit and went and fought with Azov. Some of them stayed around and made sort of super patriotic noises, but they're still connected to the Azov guys, leading to another complication. So we should be under no illusions. What the Putin system is fundamentally unsustainable. In a strange way, like the best thing that the West could have done was to launch a direct assault, which is what they did. And in the end, the contradiction that lies at the heart of the Putin system, which is trying to claim the Soviet legacy whilst also defending the destruction of it, Well, that can't last. It'll have to be resolved at one stage. And the Putin group at the moment is desperately trying to keep the balancing act going, but it won't be able to keep it going for too much longer. Hello to Matt Parker. Hello to Richard in Nevada. Hello to Sun Chu. Hello to Jonathan, who says monopolization is definitely one of the causes of inflation. That's true. We'll go into monopolization in a special episode in this series. SW Haster says crisis of imperialism equals the end of the US debt cycle, where there is not much to squeeze. I've read the interest rate of the US debt now exceeds economic growth. Yep. I was very disappointed to see Cockshot agreeing with Chibber on that article, says Stepmaster9988. Yes, my response to that coming up. Richard V says, I can verify that my profit rates have been falling like crazy. Okay. Hello to Davey in Wales. Brian T on X. Alexander Lukter says, how did it ever become acceptable to even have profits over a reasonable reward for effort level? In some way, workers or consumers or both must necessarily get fucked over. It is not a plain theft. Right. So what else we got here? Hello to Nemo Yederman from North Wales. Hello to Working Prole Incorporated, and Sid Hatfield says capitalism ultimately holds back so-called innovation. That's true. Almir says the US stock market bubble is huge, the largest PE ratio in history, worse than 1929 or 2007. Valuations of some companies are insane, especially in the AI sector. Hello to YetX. Hello to also Jenny and Cataclysm 123. Says, is there a current drive to destroy European economies? And if so, could the Ukraine conflict have any significance in hastening this outcome? It's not a drive to destroy the European economies. If you're referring to the tactics employed by the US doesn't want to destroy the European economies, because if it did so, that would have a huge knock-on impact also in the United States itself. What they're all constantly striving to do, though, is to maximize their own advantages, often at the expense of each other. And as the US is the bigger player and the leader of the global imperialist bloc, it usually comes out on top, but not always. So because they're in a crisis, they're constantly wrestling with each other about trying to find the best way out of the crisis. However, ultimately, they're stuck. And now, because the more they're stuck, the more the crisis intensifies, the more they're likely to turn on each other and fuck each other over. They don't want to destroy each other's economies because that would have disastrous consequences for themselves. But ultimately, they're left with no choice but to scalp each other if they can't scalp anybody else. It's the nature of the system to create this level of instability. Sid says, the more efficiently you can produce something, ultimately the less value it has, because no human labor or very little has been involved in producing it. Very true. The World Economic Forum, says Brian T on Twitter, X, admitted this by trying to push depopulation in the argument of environmentalism. Not a surprise. Look, the things like the World Economic Forum or the Club of Rome or various other like bourgeois think tanks, societies, secret societies, etc. They're all absolutely obsessed with the idea that if they can reduce the human population to a certain level, it'll sort of get them around various different crises. Of course, they're always then hit with the reality that what capital needs more and more labor to exploit. So you've got these bourgeois lunatics on the one hand saying that they're going to control the population, reduce it to 35,000 people per country or something ridiculous like that. That's just an extreme example, but they're all obsessed with the idea of like having a lower population, but they can't. They need a bigger and bigger labor force to exploit. So as always with the capitalists, you have them on the one hand wanting a controlled or even a smaller population, On the other hand, you have them needing a greater population in order to find a greater pool of labor to exploit. And they're still stuck in that dynamic and can't get out of it. Hello to Marius. SW Haster says, I hear China is applying AI to their production. They have factories with no lights on because it's run on AI robotics. I wonder how China will solve superfluous labor and inequality. Now, that's an interesting question. We will see exactly how serious the Chinese path to socialism is as to how they deal with that question. A planned economy, a properly planned economy, should be able to redeploy labor from factories which have now been turned over to almost entirely production done by robotics, should be able to redeploy it in productive areas and new areas of work to be done, etc. Whether I don't know what the Chinese response to that has been as yet, so that's something for me to look into. Marius says India is particularly attractive because of a huge pool of skilled labor, especially in tech and an English-speaking population. It's a big wedge between the MAGA nativists and the tech oligarchs. Yes, very true. Hello to Zama W2V over in Phoenix, Arizona. Sid Hatfield says Trump would have made a great turn of the century, last century snake oil salesman or miracle cure progenitor. It's called Trump oil, the best oil you will ever find. You rub it on a bald head, you'll grow hair. You rub it on your arthritic knees, you'll have the knees of an 18-year-old. Trust me, I've got the knees of an 18-year-old at home. Jeffrey sold them to me. Yes, I can see him doing that. Right. Marius says, Reagan's economic policies in the 80s were called voodoo economics by his critics. I don't know what you would call this gaslighting now. Desperate bottom of the barrel bullshit, I think, would be the term to use there. Hello to Sword of Dawn. Greetings from Friedrich Merz's hometown of Arnsberg. That's a boast most people wouldn't want to make. Sid says, hell, sometime in 1965, the president of Chase Manhattan Bank publicly said the U.S. military involvement in Indochina would bring an economic boom to the region, i.e. the Marshall Plan, saying it out loud. Yeah, it's funny how many times they've used the Marshall Plan as propaganda. What else we got here? Edward says, my theory, as long as the imperialists can keep printing money, they can keep the high-wage economy alive and the masses passive. Japan is an example of this. High-wage, consumer hellhole, but stable. Stable for now. I think that Japan's role as a peripheral country, not a peripheral country, but like a subject of imperial control, provides it with a little more stability in some respects than like the US has. The US has a more extreme problem with like that more and more of its population is falling into absolute poverty. And that's going to create more and more instability as time goes on. Plus, again, the more you print of something, the less it is worth. So like the currencies in the West are going to become more and more worthless the more money printing that they do under this system. Right, who else we got here? The imperialists will print themselves out of the next crisis and print enough money for enough people to have their cheap Chinese goods and Greek holidays. I don't know. I think you're wrong there. I think like most people where I live or where I've lived, most of them can't afford Greek holidays. More and more people are like getting by buying like secondhand gear, secondhand clothes. Secondhand shops do a hell of a good business these days. People are cutting spending on everything. So yeah, you'll be able to maintain a certain section of the population, but on broadly speaking, a similar comparable level to what it's living on now. But that's not something which is going to be achievable for the great bulk of the population. It's why Trump's engaging in these like desperate scams where him and Besant declare, we're going to put $2,000 in everybody's bank account, and then you got to invest that in the stock market. It's more state subsidies for the stock markets, a desperate bid to make everybody think that the stock market operates in their interests, all of which will just juice some certain stock prices, probably connected to certain members of Congress and members of the Trump administration, and they'll get rich, and then everybody else's money will disappear when the bubble pops. So I disagree with you. I think your prognosis is too negative in that sense. Ultimately, they are not going to be able to just continue with the tactics of the last 17 years. Who else we got? And also, fundamentally, the people running this system aren't too bright these days. So you're not. This is not the best and brightest. The Trump administration is not the best and brightest. Neither was the Biden administration. The level of debt in the EU region is unsustainable. The level of debt, the Eurozone debt crisis is not resolved. The EU is now leveraging itself more and more to try and provide loans to Ukraine, seeing as their attempt to do Russian asset seizure didn't work. So, yeah. Edward says, very socialistic of the CPC to save the US imperialists. Crazy. Yep. Interesting. Interesting. I mean, I imagine that their argument would be that if the US imperialists just collapsed, that would probably lead to some kind of explosive, fundamentally unstable events taking place that would have made things objectively worse for China and the rest of the world. That would maybe be their argument. Be interesting to see if they've ever said anything officially about that. Your little dialectical says, merely Decline and Fall is starting to become one of my favorites. Have you seen the Putin interview with Tucker Carlson? I watched it in its entirety. It seems like he was employing historical materialism. Yeah, I did a show on that a while back. It's true, but Putin does apply that from time to time because he was trained in that. Unfortunately, he doesn't apply it often enough to the situation inside Russia. Jenny says Putin should have just listened to the KPRF from the start. They're always right, and a whole lot of lives may have been saved if they'd gone in sooner. That's true, but then again, if you if you adopt the policies of the KPRF, it would have meant a headlong collision with the Russian bourgeoisie, who are almost uniformly like treacherous, and they hide behind their the Orthodox Church and their veneration of the Russian monarchy, but they still want to get back into the good graces of the West. So therein lies the contradiction. If you go with the KPRF's victory program, that leads you into a confrontation with the Russian oligarchy. And Putin has been good to honor and has honored his deal. He's been as good as his word to the Russian oligarchy. They've been allowed to keep their purloined wealth. Still, to this day, won't get rid of the wretched Russian central bank governor, Nabulina, whose decisions only benefit like the asset strippers in the Russian capitalist class by continually giving them advantageous positions to export capital out of the country. To this day, the Russian economic development is strangled and crippled by the Russian central bank. Why? Because the Russian central bank operates in the interests of the asset strippers and the parasites. Right. Just going through some more comments here. Robert Monk says Millet is a piece of shit. Yeah, exactly. Hello to Bob in Australia, and hello to Shelley. Robert Monk says the fraud of neoliberalism is revealed in South America, especially in Argentina. People are aware Millet is a piece of shit. Millet. Another comment ends there. Sophia says that the Trump impression always makes your day. Well, happy to be of service in this respect. Edward says, do you see the crisis of imperialism reaching a point where they decide to commit to not a piecemeal but full-fledged assault on sections of the domestic working class in the West. We're reaching the point where that becomes more likely, is my answer to that question. We're reaching the point where it becomes more likely that they will have to do that. They've been desperate not to do it, not out of sentimental or humanitarian reasons, you understand, but because of fear of the response. If they take on everybody at once, they will likely generate a massive backlash. So they'll try and do isolated attacks where they could, and try to do assaults on one particular section of the working class. It's reaching the point now where they won't be able to do that. When they lose if and when they lose in Ukraine, the crisis will intensify further. They can't do anything about China. They're impotent against China unless they can they can exploit some kind of internal division within China, or some kind of color revolution attempt comes off for them, which I just can't see happening. Then they'll end up screwed. They'll have to turn on the domestic working class and the petty bourgeoisie all at once, certain sections of the petty bourgeoisie, or certainly the entire working class. So even the labor aristocracy will get fucked. And at that point, you'll see like a huge upsurge of open class warfare that you haven't seen for 4 or 5 decades. And at that point, you'll see some serious instability break out in the West. They will be desperate for that not to happen there. They will be desperate to avoid that at all costs. It's likely that they won't have a choice much longer. Edward says, it's funny how Alexander Mercurius of the Duran praises Nabiullina from the Russian Central Bank and also loves Russia's sovereignty assertion. Schizophrenic by praising comprador moves and independence. Yeah, it's almost as if social democrats don't have a fucking clue about what's happening in the world, isn't it? Right. So, I'm going to bring things to a close for this week. I will be back with another edition of this show next week. So in the next few days on Patreon, we've got the next show on Gramsci and a special on Ethiopian socialism, or the Derg period of the 70s, 80s, and very early 90s. That's coming up on Monday. The Gramsci show coming up probably on Tuesday. And then we'll have a Christmas special stream for everybody, which will happen just before Christmas Day. But until next time, I thank everybody for tuning in for the second part of The Fall of the West. Tune in next time for part 3. And we will then be proceeding onwards with chronicling how the West has fallen or is falling. So be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. Be sure to subscribe to our various platforms. Please be sure to support the show on Patreon and buy me a coffee or Substack if you haven't done so already. All support is appreciated. Be back with you again very soon. I will now have you handed over to your musical and video outro.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.